When a public school teacher, on the verge of quitting, cried out on a school board live stream, "Mr. Freeman, they're making us lie to our children," he didn't expect the legendary actor to respond by publicly challenging the president's new educational directives. The immediate effect, in the beige, windowless room of the Northwood County School District meeting, was utter silence. The board members, who had been impatiently checking their watches, froze. The plea from David McIntyre, a history teacher with 15 years of service, hung in the air. A raw and unexpected indictment that shattered the evening's banal agenda of bus routes and bake sale approvals. Within minutes, the clip, isolated from the 2-hour live stream by a local parent, began its digital journey. It wasn't a thunderous explosion online, but a slow, creeping fire passed from one concerned parent group to another. Then to education bloggers who saw in McIntyre's desperate face the exhaustion of their entire profession. By morning, the quiet plea from a small town in Ohio was being replayed on cable news, no longer a local complaint, but a national symbol of a brewing cultural war. Just 1 week earlier, the conflict had been nothing more than a triumphant press release from the White House. President Donald Trump stood at a podium, flanked by American flags, announcing his new Patriotic American History Initiative. The program, he declared, was designed to end the culture of apology and teach our children to love their country, not to be ashamed of it. It was a classic Trump move, turning a complex academic debate into a simple, powerful message of national pride. He spoke of restoring greatness, of cutting out the radical leftist agenda from classrooms, and ensuring every student knew that America was the greatest nation in the history of the world, period. The crowd at the political rally where he previewed the announcement had roared its approval. To his supporters, it wasn't an erasure of history. It was a restoration of sanity, a necessary correction to decades of what they saw as navel-gazing and national self-loathing. The president was confident, basking in the applause. He was fixing something he believed was fundamentally broken, and he had no patience for nuance or opposition. The policy was bold, the language was clear, and as far as the administration was concerned, the matter was settled. Hundreds of miles away, on his sprawling Mississippi ranch, Morgan Freeman was entirely unaware of the political firestorm the initiative was about to ignite. His world was one of quiet routine and creative focus. He spent his mornings with his horses and his afternoons reviewing scripts. His latest project was a documentary series on the hidden ecosystems of the deep ocean, and his mind was filled with the otherworldly beauty of bioluminescent creatures, not the dry language of educational policy. His longtime producing partner, Lori McCreary, mentioned the president's new initiative over a video call. "They're rolling out a new history curriculum, Morgan. Standardized. Sounds like it's causing a bit of a stir with teacher unions," she said, more as a casual observation than a serious point of business. Freeman had simply grunted in response. A flicker of unease, perhaps, but nothing more. He had narrated the American story many times, from the Civil War in glory to the long walk to freedom in documentaries about Nelson Mandela. He understood the country's narrative not as a simple line of inevitable greatness, but as a complex tapestry of struggle, sin, redemption, and profound courage. The idea of simplifying that story, of sanding down its rough edges, felt inherently wrong to him, like colorizing a classic black and white film. It might make it more palatable to some, but it would rob it of its truth. Still, it was a political matter, and he had long made it a policy to stay out of the direct political fray. His role, as he saw it, was to be a storyteller, not a pundit. That line began to blur in an Ohio classroom, where David McIntyre felt his career, his very identity as an educator, crumbling under the weight of a stack of newly printed curriculum binders. He sat at his desk long after his students had gone home, the silence of the room amplifying the roar of conflict in his mind. For 15 years, he had taught American history at Northwood High, He believed his job was not to instill blind patriotism, but to forge informed citizens. He taught the brilliance of the Constitution alongside the hypocrisy of its slave-owning authors. He celebrated the valor of D-Day soldiers, while also forcing his students to confront the moral catastrophe of Japanese-American internment. His students learned that patriotism wasn't about believing your country was perfect. It was about loving it enough to hold it accountable to its own ideals. The new binders, mandated by the state to comply with the president's initiative, gutted that philosophy. The Trail of Tears was now described in a single paragraph as a population resettlement. The brutal realities of slavery were minimized, overshadowed by lengthy passages on the economic ingenuity of the plantation system. The civil rights movement was framed almost as a polite debate that was amicably resolved, its violence and terror surgically removed. It was a lie. A clean, well-packaged, government-approved lie. The next day, he tried to reason with his principal, a weary man named Mr. Henderson, whose main priority was keeping the school off the radar of the state's Department of Education. "David, just teach what's in the book," Henderson said, not meeting his eyes. "My job is to make sure these kids graduate and this school stays funded. Your job is to follow the curriculum. It's that simple." But it wasn't simple. To David, it was a profound betrayal of his students and his conscience. The temptation was overwhelming. Not to fight, but to flee. He could just quit. Find another job. Let someone else teach the lies. His wife, Alara, a pharmacist, saw the toll it was taking on him. "David, it's not worth it," she pleaded one evening. "You're killing yourself over this. We'll be fine if you leave. Your health is more important." He knew she was right, but the thought of surrendering felt like a deeper kind of death. He had one last chance to be heard, the monthly school board meeting. He didn't plan what he was going to say. He only knew he couldn't stay silent. The meeting was as dull as he'd expected. He sat through tedious presentations, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. When his name was finally called for the 3-minute public comment period, he walked to the lectern, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. He started calmly, outlining the specific historical inaccuracies in the new curriculum, pointing to the omissions, the euphemisms. He could see the board members' eyes glazing over. The board chair, a local real estate developer named Brenda Davies, cut him off. "Mr. McIntyre, your time is almost up. Do you have a specific request for the board?" The condescension in her voice snapped something inside him. All the frustration, the professional despair, the feeling of being utterly alone in his fight, coalesced into a single, desperate act. He wasn't speaking to the board anymore. He looked past them, into the small, unmanned camera lens that was live-streaming the proceedings to a handful of viewers. He thought of the documentaries he used to show his class, the calm, authoritative voice that made history feel real and important, and he spoke to that voice, as if calling out for help in a vast wilderness. "This isn't a curriculum. It's propaganda," he said, his own voice cracking. "I can't do it. I can't look my students in the eye and teach them this." "Mr. Freeman," he said, the name coming unbidden to his lips, a plea to a symbol of integrity. "Mr. Freeman, they're making us lie to our children." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the room's ventilation. Brenda Davies stared, mouth agape. David stepped back from the lectern, spent and suddenly terrified by what he had just done. He had crossed a line, and he had no idea what was on the other side. The next morning, the clip was waiting for Morgan Freeman when he came down for breakfast. Aubrey McCreary had flown in overnight from Los Angeles, an unusual move that signaled the gravity of the situation. She didn't say a word, simply handed him her tablet. He watched the video of the tired, earnest teacher making his desperate appeal. He watched it once, then a second time, his expression unreadable. The man on the screen wasn't an activist. He wasn't a pundit. He was a teacher in pain, cornered into an impossible choice between his livelihood and his integrity. The invocation of his own name was startling, but he understood it instantly. David McIntyre wasn't calling out to Morgan Freeman, the celebrity. He was calling out to the narrator of history, the public custodian of the American story. It was a cry for help directed at the principal he had come to represent. "What are the president's people saying?" Freeman asked, his voice low and steady. "So far, nothing," Laurie said. "It's just starting to bubble up. But it will get to them." Freeman stood up and walked to the large window overlooking his property. For a long time, he just watched his horses grazing in the morning mist. He had spent a lifetime using his voice to tell stories, believing in their power to illuminate and connect. Now, the silence of a story not being told, the silence being forced upon teachers like David McIntyre, was demanding he use his voice in a different way. It was a demand he could not refuse. "Get me the organizers of that education summit in D.C., he said, turning back to Laurie. "The one next week. Tell them I'd like to attend." The issue landed on President Trump's desk 2 days later, just as Freeman had predicted. An aide, wanting to appear informed, showed him the clip of David McIntyre during his morning intelligence briefing. "It's getting some traction on the cable shows, Mr. President," the aide said. "The media is trying to make this teacher into a folk hero." The president watched the clip, his expression souring. He saw not a man in pain, but an obstacle. He saw a public employee challenging his authority, and worse, using the media to do it. His political instincts, honed over decades, told him to crush the narrative before it grew. He was scheduled to hold a press conference that afternoon on trade policy, and he decided to address the issue head-on. It was a strategic error born of pure overconfidence. Standing in the White House briefing room, after announcing new tariffs, he took a question from a reporter about the Ohio teacher. The president leaned into the microphone, a dismissive smirk on his face. "I saw the clip," he said. "Very sad. They have some of these radical activists. They get a job as a teacher, and they're unhappy with teaching American greatness. They want to teach the kids to hate our country, and now they're crying to movie stars. It's a disgrace." The words shot across the airwaves, a splash of gasoline on a smoldering fire. In his attempt to belittle David McIntyre, President Trump had inadvertently elevated him. He had turned a teacher's heartfelt plea into a direct confrontation, a radical activist versus a president defending American greatness. And he had, without realizing it, officially invited Morgan Freeman onto the battlefield. The stage was now set for the National Education Summit in Washington, D.C., an event that was about to become far more than a dry discussion of policy. It was about to become a referendum on the story of America itself. The Future of Education Summit was held in the cavernous ballroom of a D.C. hotel, an event designed to project consensus and control. The attendees were a carefully curated mix of state-level administrators, think tank fellows, and a handful of award-winning teachers who could be counted on to stay on message. The air was stale with practiced speeches and bureaucratic jargon. The centerpiece of the morning was the keynote address from the Secretary of Education, a staunch loyalist to President Trump. She delivered a polished defense of the patriotic American History Initiative, replete with slides showing rising test scores in pilot districts and quotes from founding fathers taken carefully out of context. She praised the president's bold vision and decried the forces of division who sought to weaponize the classroom for their own political ends. It was a speech designed to be unassailable, a smooth wall of rhetoric that offered no handholds for dissent. She concluded to polite, sustained applause. David McIntyre watched the speech from his home in Ohio. The school had placed him on paid administrative leave, a gentle form of exile. He was a hero and a villain all at once. His email inbox was a dizzying split screen of praise and poison. Parents from his district sent messages of support, while anonymous accounts sent him photos of his house with threatening captions. His wife, Elara, jumped every time the phone rang. He sat on his couch, watching the summit on his laptop, feeling 1,000,000 miles away from the gilded ballroom and the powerful people deciding his fate. He had shot his arrow into the air, and now he felt only a profound sense of helplessness, a fear that his small act of defiance would be swallowed by the machine, forgotten by the next news cycle. Back in the D.C. ballroom, the Q&A session after the secretary's speech began. The questions were softballs, lobbed by pre-screened attendees. "Madam Secretary, how can we best support our teachers in implementing this visionary curriculum?" one superintendent asked. As the secretary began her practiced answer, a quiet shift was happening at the back of the room. Morgan Freeman, who had arrived not through the main entrance but through a service corridor, was escorted by a single, nervous event organizer to a staff aisle near the main stage. He wore a simple, dark suit, no tie. He looked not like a movie star, but like a concerned citizen who had earned the right to be there. He stood in the shadows, waiting. The moderator looked at his watch. "We have time for one last question," he announced. A junior event staffer, following the instructions given to him only minutes before, walked a microphone not to an audience member, but down the aisle to where Freeman stood. A ripple of confusion went through the room, followed by audible gasps as people recognized the iconic figure stepping out of the shadows. The news cameras, which had been lazily pointed at the stage, swiveled with a sudden, sharp focus. The low murmur of the room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Freeman didn't wait to be introduced. He walked calmly toward the stage, taking the microphone from the staffer. He didn't climb the stairs. He stood on the floor, on the same level as the audience, and looked up at the secretary, who stared back, her polite political smile frozen on her face. "Madam Secretary," Freeman began, his voice needing no amplification but filling the room nonetheless. It was the voice the world knew, the voice of God, of presidents, of the narrator of life itself. But today, it carried a different weight. Not of performance, but of profound personal conviction. "I am not an educator. I am not a politician. I am a storyteller, and I have a question about the story we are now being asked to tell." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "I have, in my life, had the profound honor of telling parts of our nation's story. I have told the story of the soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, who were brave enough to fight for a country that refused to see them as full citizens. I have told the story of a man who spent 27 years in a prison cell and emerged to teach his nation about forgiveness. He took a step closer to the stage. These stories are not always easy to hear. They are filled with pain and contradiction, but they are true. And they are the source of our greatest strength. They teach us that we are a nation capable of looking at our deepest flaws and, through great struggle, overcoming them." He looked past the secretary now, his eyes finding the lens of the main news camera at the back of the room. He was no longer speaking to the people in the ballroom. He was speaking to the nation. He was speaking to David McIntyre, watching on a laptop in Ohio. A teacher in Ohio was recently called a radical activist because he believes his students deserve the whole story. He was accused of not loving his country because he wants to teach its truths. "But I ask you," Freeman's voice grew stronger, a quiet power that commanded attention more than any shout could. "What is the greater act of patriotism? To read a sanitized, state-approved script that pretends we have no flaws? Or to trust our children with the full, complex, and often difficult truth of our past, in the faith that they can learn from it and build a better future?" He let the question hang in the air for a beat. The secretary was speechless. The moderator was frozen. "Telling the truth about our history," Freeman concluded, his voice clear and resonant. "All of it is the ultimate act of patriotism. Greatness is not afraid of the facts." He placed the microphone on the edge of the stage, gave a slight, respectful nod to the stunned secretary, and turned. He walked back down the aisle the way he had come, and disappeared through the service door before the first frantic shouts from reporters could even erupt. He didn't need to stay for the fallout. His work was done. The ballroom exploded into chaos. But a story had been told, a truth had been spoken, and the narrative of the entire debate had been irrevocably changed. The moment Morgan Freeman disappeared through the service door, the dam of stunned silence in the hotel ballroom broke. A tidal wave of noise crashed through the room as reporters, finally jolting into action, scrambled over chairs and each other, shouting questions at the empty aisle. The moderator tapped his microphone uselessly, but his voice was lost in the pandemonium. The Secretary of Education was hurried off the stage by her aides, her face a mask of controlled fury. The summit was over. The spectacle had just begun. Within the hour, the clip of Freeman's speech was the lead story on every news platform. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a cultural detonation. Cable news channels, recognizing the raw power of the confrontation, ran it on a continuous loop. They created a brutal, effective split screen. On the left, President Trump, smirking at his rally, dismissing a teacher as a radical activist. On the right, Morgan Freeman, standing on the floor of the summit, his face etched with solemn purpose, delivering his quiet indictment about the nature of truth and patriotism. There was no need for commentary. The visual contrast was the story, and it was devastating. David McIntyre, the radical activist from Ohio, was no longer an anonymous teacher. His name and face were now permanently fused to Freeman's. His plea the prelude to the actor's powerful sermon. He was the everyman at the heart of an epic battle between a president and a living legend. In his suite on the top floor of the hotel, Morgan Freeman felt none of the victory that was being proclaimed in his name on television. He had taken off his suit jacket and loosened his collar, but he couldn't shake the chill of the adrenaline leaving his body. It left behind a profound exhaustion, the kind that sinks deep into your bones. This was not the pleasant fatigue that follows a day of good work on a film set. This was the draining weight of consequence. He had deliberately stepped into the fire, and he could already feel its heat. His phone buzzed on the table, and he saw his daughter's name, Morgana, on the screen. He braced himself and answered, "Dad, are you okay?" Her voice was tight with worry. He could hear the frantic energy of a news broadcast in the background of her call. "I'm fine, honey. Just a little tired," he said, his voice softer now, gentler. "A little tired, Dad? It's everywhere. The things people are saying online, the comments sections, the threats, they're posting pictures of your ranch. You know what these people are like. They're unhinged." "I know," he said calmly. He had known this was part of the price. "We'll take precautions. Lori is already handling it. Don't you worry about me." "How can I not worry?" she replied, her voice close to breaking. "You're not a politician. You're my father. Why did you have to do this?" It was the question he had been asking himself. He looked out the window at the distant, gleaming dome of the Capitol building. "Because that man in Ohio, that teacher, he asked for help," Freeman said simply. "Sometimes, if you're in a position to help, you don't have a choice. You just have to." He reassured her, promised to call again in the morning, and ended the call. She sat in the silent room, the glow of the television muted, and felt utterly alone. He had used his voice, his most powerful tool, and in doing so had invited a world of ugliness into the quiet life he had so carefully built. The cost of speaking out was only just beginning to be calculated. For David McIntyre, that cost was being delivered directly to his front door. He had watched Freeman's speech on his laptop, tears of gratitude streaming down his face. For a few glorious hours, he felt vindicated, seen, and profoundly understood. But as the day turned into night, the triumphant narrative on the national news curdled into a terrifying reality on his quiet suburban street. A local news van was now permanently parked across the road, its camera a single, unblinking eye. His social media was a toxic sludge of messages so vile he had to shut down his accounts. Alara had taken their 2 young children to her sister's house, afraid of what might happen next. Her fears were realized just after midnight. A loud crash from the living room jolted David from a restless sleep. He ran downstairs to find the front window shattered, a brick lying on the floor amidst a spray of broken glass. Tied to it with twine was a piece of cardboard, a single word scrawled on it in thick, black marker. Traitor. He stood there, heart hammering, the cold night air washing over him. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a violation. Ilara rushed home when he called, her face pale with terror and fury. "That's it, David. It's over," she said, her voice a strained whisper as she swept up the glass. "You call that school tomorrow, and you resign. You tell the news you were wrong. I don't care what you do, but you make this stop." Was it worth this? Was putting our family in danger worth making a point about a history book? He looked at the brick on the floor, at the ugly word written on the cardboard, and then at the terrified face of his wife. He had wanted to be a hero for his students. Instead, he felt like a fool who had endangered his own family. The pride he had felt was gone, replaced by a sickening knot of fear and doubt. "I don't know," he answered honestly, and the uncertainty in his own voice scared him more than the shattered window. The national debate, meanwhile, settled into a predictable and savage rhythm. The White House and its allies in the media launched a full-scale assault on Morgan Freeman. He was branded an arrogant Hollywood liberal, an out-of-touch millionaire who presumed to lecture hard-working Americans about patriotism. They dug up old interviews, twisted quotes, and ran segments questioning his charity work. On the other side, progressive commentators and opponents of the president lionized him, declaring him the conscience of a nation and the leader of the moral resistance. Freeman was now a symbol, a caricature being used by both sides in a political war that had little to do with the actual substance of his message. The conversation was loud, furious, and going nowhere. The man who would break the stalemate was, at that moment, sitting in a leather armchair in his quiet, book-lined office in Palo Alto, California. Dr. Alastair Finch was 82 years old, a renowned historian at a conservative think tank, and the author of several definitive books on the American founding. He was a pillar of the intellectual right, a man whose words carried immense weight in the circles the president claimed as his own. He had supported Donald Trump's election, not for his style, but for his policies on the economy and the judiciary. He had, until now, remained silent on the Patriotic History Initiative, viewing it as a clumsy but perhaps well-intentioned effort. And as he watched the news reports, a deep and profound disgust began to stir in him. He saw Morgan Freeman's reasoned, principled argument being shouted down by partisan hacks. He saw the president's administration defending their policy not with historical evidence, but with ad hominem attacks. Most offensively to him, he saw the entire discipline of history, his life's work, being degraded into a political cudgel. It was, he thought, a sign of profound ideological weakness. A truly confident nation does not need to lie to itself. A truly great nation is strong enough to examine its own sins. The administration's position was not patriotism, it was cowardice, dressed up in the flag. Dr. Finch was a man of routine. He did not tweet. He did not go on cable news. He wrote. He turned off the television, walked over to his large oak desk, and switched on his computer. He began to type, his fingers moving with a slow, deliberate certainty. He was not writing to defend Morgan Freeman, the actor. He was writing to defend a principle that he believed was fundamental to the survival of the Republic, the principle of historical truth. He began to construct his argument, not with emotion, but with cold, hard evidence from the very history the new curriculum sought to erase. He cited letters from John Adams about the evils of slavery, speeches by Lincoln on the painful necessity of the Civil War, and writings by Theodore Roosevelt on the importance of honest national self-critique. He framed his argument from an unapologetically conservative viewpoint. To erase the trail of tears from our memory is not to honor America. It is to dishonor the very concept of justice upon which our laws are built, he wrote. To soften the horrors of the civil rights struggle is not to praise our progress. It is to insult the courage of those who forced a reluctant nation to live up to its founding creed. President Trump argues that we must teach American greatness. I agree. But greatness is not a fragile thing that shatters upon contact with the truth. It is a diamond forged in the immense pressure of our own contradictions. He worked for hours, meticulously crafting each sentence. The final paragraph was a direct challenge to his own side of the political spectrum. Quote, Mr. Freeman, an actor, has been accused of being political, but on this matter, it is he who is defending a profoundly conservative principle, that the past is real, that facts are stubborn things, and that truth is the only foundation upon which a durable nation can be built. The president's policy, however well-intentioned, is an exercise in radical revisionism that will weaken, not strengthen, our children's love for their country. A love that is not tested by truth is nothing more than sentimentality. Our nation and our children deserve better. He titled the op-ed simply, "Patriotism Requires Truth." He proofread it once, then sent it to the opinion editor of the Wall Street Journal, a man he had known for 20 years in New York City. That editor, preparing to leave for the night, saw the email from Dr. Finch and opened it immediately. He began to read. His eyebrows shot up. He read the essay again, more slowly this time. He leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. He knew exactly what he was holding. It was a bomb. It was a document that would not just contribute to the national debate, but completely shatter and reframe it. He picked up his phone and called the paper's publisher at home. "You're not going to believe what Alastair Finch just sent me," he said. "We're tearing up tomorrow's page. This is going on the front." The publication of Dr. Alastair Finch's op-ed was not a ripple. It was a seismic shock. It landed on the desks of Washington, D.C. with the force of a formal indictment. The White House press office was thrown into chaos. Their entire strategy, which hinged on painting Morgan Freeman as a lone, partisan Hollywood actor, had been demolished overnight by a single essay from one of their own intellectual champions. Surrogates who were scheduled to go on television to attack Freeman suddenly canceled their appearances. The official line, when press secretary was finally forced to comment, was a weak and flustered statement about how the president welcomes a robust debate from all sides on how to best honor our nation's history. The aggression was gone, replaced by a clumsy, transparent retreat. The narrative had been broken. Morgan Freeman saw the opening not as a chance to declare victory, but as an opportunity to deliver the final word, to lift the entire conversation above the toxic swamp of partisan politics. He turned down interview requests from every major network. He had no interest in a televised debate or a victory lap. Instead, he called Lori McCreary and told her to set up a single camera in a quiet room at his production company's office in Los Angeles. No professional lighting, no makeup, no teleprompter. Just him, a chair, and a lens. The video appeared on his company's YouTube channel 2 days later, without any prior announcement. It began with a tight shot of Freeman's face. He looked directly into the camera, his expression open and earnest. "A long time ago," he began, his voice a low, intimate murmur, "I was preparing for a role in a film about the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first all-black regiments in the Union Army. Part of my research took me to the battlefields, where they fought. I stood on the ground at Fort Wagner in South Carolina, where nearly half of them were killed or wounded in a single, heroic, and doomed charge." He paused, and it felt as if he was looking back in time. "I read their letters home. These were men who had been born into slavery or lived as second-class citizens. They were fighting for the freedom of a country that had given them nothing but pain, a country that refused to see them as full human beings, and yet they fought with a courage that is, to this day, breathtaking. Standing on that ground, I felt the full, crushing weight of that contradiction. The ugliness and the beauty, the sin and the sacrifice, all wrapped up together. That," he said, leaning slightly closer to the camera, "is the American story. No family is perfect. We don't pretend to our children that their grandparents were saints, or that our family has never known strife or sorrow. We teach them that we argue, we make mistakes, we hurt each other, and we forgive each other. We teach them that the family is strong, not because it is flawless, but because it endures its flaws and keeps trying to be better. We love it for its imperfections, not in spite of them." He let the simple analogy settle. A country is no different. The story of America is not a fairy tale of uninterrupted glory. It is the greatest story ever told, because it is about a flawed, beautiful, and ongoing struggle to be better. It's a story of a nation constantly fighting to live up to the meaning of its own magnificent words. Our children are strong enough for that story. They are worthy of it. They deserve the honor of that truth. He said nothing more. He simply held his gaze for a moment, then gave a slight nod. The screen went to black. The video was less than 3 minutes long. But its impact was final. It was unassailable. It had reframed the entire debate from a political squabble to a profound question of national character. Within the week, the political battle was over. On a Friday afternoon, the traditional time for a government to release news it wants buried, the Department of Education issued a quiet press release. It announced the formation of a bipartisan presidential committee tasked with a comprehensive review to refine and enhance the Patriotic American History Initiative. The language was bureaucratic code for an indefinite suspension. It was a surrender, wrapped in the flag of committee procedure. That same afternoon, David McIntyre's phone rang. It was Principal Henderson. His voice was awkward, apologetic. "David," he said, "the board has concluded its review. Your administrative leave has been lifted, effective immediately. We'd be glad to have you back in the classroom on Monday." The threat of dismissal was gone, evaporated into thin air. When David returned to Northwood High that Monday morning, feeling nervous and exposed, he walked into his first period history class to the sound of thunderous applause from his students. He looked at their young, smiling faces and felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He had not betrayed them. He had kept his promise. 3 weeks later, and 1,000 miles away, the lasting echo of David's plea resonated in a classroom in Portland, Oregon. Amara Kendrick, a 28-year-old history teacher, stood by her desk, her stomach churning with anxiety. Her principal had strongly suggested that she skip the unit on the Minidoka internment camp, where thousands of Japanese American citizens from the Pacific Northwest had been imprisoned during World War II. "It's a difficult topic, Amara," the principal had said. "With the current climate, maybe it's best to focus on more unifying subjects." Amara had been about to agree. She was young, non-tenured, and didn't want to make waves. But then she looked at her bulletin board. Tacked to the cork was a copy of Dr. Alistair Finch's op-ed, printed from the newspaper's website. Its headline stark and clear: "Patriotism requires truth." Next to it, she had pinned a screenshot from the news of David McIntyre, standing in front of his home, his window boarded up but his expression resolute. She looked at those two documents, the words of the elderly conservative scholar and the image of the defiant Midwestern teacher. They were strangers, but in that moment they felt like her allies, her reinforcements. They had fought their battle and armed her for her own. She took a deep, steadying breath, picked up the stack of lesson plans from her desk, plans filled with first-hand accounts from Minidoka survivors and stark, black-and-white photographs of the camp. She smoothed the front of her blouse, turned to face her waiting students, and with a new, firm voice, she began. "Today," she said, "we are going to talk about a difficult part of our state's history, because it's important that we remember all of it." The fight was far from over, but a seed of courage had been planted, and in classrooms all across the country, it was beginning to grow. So what do you think? Is it more patriotic to present a flawless version of your country's history, or to confront its difficult truths head-on? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And for more stories about the moments that define us, don't forget to like and subscribe.